Two world wars tore the heart out of the 20th century. They are a rent in the fabric of history. One world before, another after. Between these two tragedies, a mere 20 years. 20 years of peace that produced war. A peace that failed. Impossible peace. In 4 years of fighting, the First World War had claimed a life every 25 seconds. And when the mincing machine stopped on November the 11th, 1918, the bill that had been run up was enormous.
Great Britain lost 15% of her entire international wealth during the First World War.
What had been the point of it all? Surely it was that out of all the grief and loss would come a new world order. One in which peace and prosperity would replace inequality, injustice, and dynastic swagger.
For a long time, historians saw this moment as a sharp guillotine moment when the world pivoted from this terrible conflict to a new era. It wasn't as tidy as that.
History is only interesting because nothing is inevitable. That the First World War would reverberate through two tumultuous decades, the 1920s and 30s, to re-emerge transformed and more deadly was not inevitable. But 20 years after the guns fell silent, they were again about their business. Louder and more lethal than ever. Why? Why did the peace that people prayed and paid for last little more than 20 years? Why did tyrants rise to control the fate of continents? Why did a world that had survived a war collapse into an unprecedented depression? Why was an age that nostalgia views enthusiastically as a time of jazz, prohibition, the talkies, the radio, and the motor car, in reality an age of anxiety, when the underlying current was flowing towards disaster? The catalogue of questions of what ifs and why did theys starts with the first year of peace. At the beginning of the First World War, the United States owed Europe $4 billion. At the end, Europe owed the USA $10 billion. And America was making half of the world's manufactured goods. And this bright, shining shadow spread by the mass-producing, richly resourced, supremely powerful USA hung over the small states and old states of Europe.
World War I really transformed the global economic system because it brought to an end the era of British free trade dominated international economy and introduced a much more autarkic international economy dominated by the United States.
How were the old world states to avoid tumbling into insignificance?
George V said, well, we've got nothing to worry about now. We are top dogs now, George V said. A lovely phrase.
In January 1919, against the wishes of the British cabinet minister responsible, the imperial government, the top dog in India, proposed extending its wartime emergency powers indefinitely. The result was popular and massive protest.
The end of the First World War in India was a moment of great hope. India had been a loyal member of the British Empire and imperial armies, almost 1.25 million Indian troops fought under the British flag in the First World War.
In a few short months, cities were in an uproar. Local martial law was being imposed. In Punjab, sweeping preventative arrests sparked counter-demonstrations in which 5 Europeans were murdered. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer was sent with 300 colonial troops to Amritsar, where in April he faced a crowd of 20,000 which refused to disperse. So, Brigadier Dyer gave the order to open fire. The firing went on for 10 minutes, without answer from the unarmed crowd. After 10 minutes, 379 men, women and children were dead. Hundreds more were wounded.
During the interwar period, most Americans disliked the British Empire. They saw it as a British heel on the necks of people all around the world, and this, of course, was not helped by the Amritsar massacre, which people rapidly learned about.
The Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, presenting his report to the House of Commons, called the massacre at Amritsar a shameful act of racial humiliation and declared that Dyer was guilty of terrorism and Prussianism. In one of the British Parliament's less proud moments, Montagu was shouted down by the Tory opposition with racist bluster and anti-Semitic remarks.
The massacre at Amritsar in 1919 transformed the Indian national movement, both for the older, previously loyal generation and for the younger, radical nationalists. They really felt one could no longer be loyal to the British imperial cause.
Perversely, the British people remained loyal to the unrepentant Dyer. The London Morning Post opened a fund for the general, which, when it was closed, had raked in more than £26,000 at a time when a skilled worker, like a bricklayer, was earning a little over £100 a year. Other empires did not confront the challenge of a new world. They had not survived the war. The German Empire was gone. So too the Austro-Hungarian. The Russian had preceded them. The Ottoman followed. Within 48 hours of the Kaiser's flight, 25 German dynasties had abdicated.
The breakup of all the empires, the breakup of the German Empire, breakup of the Ottoman Empire, breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You had 13 states that had not been states before. They didn't have financial systems. They didn't have central markets. They had to be created out of wartime debris, one might also say.
Germany had never had a functional democracy. The Chancellor was made accountable to the Reichstag only 2 weeks before the armistice, in the hope that peace talks would be found more congenial if the German delegates were representing a democracy.
In Germany, the traditional elites were kicked out in 1918. Aristocracy ended, monarchy went, the army was humbled, reduced to 100,000 men. And so the people who had maintained the kind of social and political stability before 1914 didn't disappear, but they lost that function.
In Germany, the Social Democrats planned a parliamentary democracy, but they were obliged to share power with the Spartacists, who, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, were intent on following the path of the Bolshevik Revolution. It seemed most likely that Germany, like Russia before it, would follow defeat with revolution. But the Freikorps, mainly ex-servicemen, homemade armies, as Richard Overy called them, murdered Liebknecht and Luxemburg and crushed the Spartacists on the streets of Berlin. After the elections, and because of the unrest in Berlin, the assembly met for the first time in the town in Thuringia that gave its name to the Republic, Weimar. "76% of the electorate voted for the Weimar Republic. 14 years later, almost the same proportion voted for the anti-democratic parties of right and left, whose only common cause was destruction of the Republic. The reason why they flipped is a fundamental motif of the interwar years.
The Weimar political arrangement allowed for very small parties to make it past the post. And so that created this possibility that either no coalition can be stable, or that an infinite number of coalitions in a way are possible, and that no strong political force can really emerge.
Russia went from Tsarist empire to communist republic in 9 months. Germany from authoritarian monarchy to parliamentary republic in 9 days. Allowances should have been made. They went. The event of 1919 that would codify this new world order was the Peace Conference, a story of chaps and naps, in historian Zara Steiner's phrase. Had the newly elected German government been made part of the peace process, things might have gone differently. But it was not. The process was in the hands of Great Britain, France, Italy, and, above all, the American President Woodrow Wilson.
A lot of Europeans wanted the same sorts of things that Woodrow Wilson was portraying. They wanted a better world because they had just seen what the war had done throughout Europe.
In 1919, you get lots of demonstrations welcoming Wilson, people on the streets everywhere thinking that this is a great new moment and opportunity for a new kind of world. So this sort of story of violence sits against this story of optimism and hope.
In May 1919, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George remarked that as long as America, England and France stand together, we can keep the world from going to pieces. Well, perhaps he was right, but the three victorious powers could not stand together in any meaningful sense. They never had.
Wilson was a neophyte in international negotiations, and he was pretty well played by the Allies at Versailles, and he had a compromise on a number of things that he did not want to compromise on.
The peace, which seems, in the context, a boundlessly unsuitable word, added 1 million square miles to Britain's empire and about a quarter of that to the French. In the carve-up of Central Europe, the peacemakers created a buffer zone, but it comprised unstable, uncertain states. The Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, a diminished Hungary, Yugoslavia, and it set them like a nut between the jaws of a cracker. It was hoped that the creation of this cordon sanitaire of small states would, sponge-like, absorb any leaking Bolshevism before it contaminated the waterways of the West. Lloyd George said it was a strategy which would not allow him to conceive any greater cause of future war. The division of Europe contrived at Versailles contained population anomalies that were to prove destabilizing. The American president looked at the map and preached self-determination. But in Europe, ethnicities and language groups had been crisscrossing the continent for centuries, and self-determination was a tricky principle to apply. The president had kicked a hornet's nest. Only 65% of the population of Poland was Polish. 51% of Czechoslovakians were Czech. And only 44% of Yugoslavians were from the ruling and dominant Serbs. The 13th of Wilson's 14 points stipulated that Poland should have free access to the sea, which could only be achieved by dividing East Prussia from the rest of Germany, which might have looked quite neat on a map.
Infrastructurally, it was a major problem to create this new Polish state. Different judicial systems, different currencies when they started. Even the railway system was, of course, the imperial railway system. So there was no connection, for example, between the capital Warsaw, the new capital, and Lviv, one of the major cities, because this was in Austria.
Hungary lost 75% of its territory and 3 million of its population at Versailles. Austria lost an empire, and Bulgaria, similarly punished for backing the wrong horse, lost territory and 1 million of its population. Woodrow Wilson placed great store in the idea of self-determination. But there was a conundrum. What should be done with Germany's former colonies? They were, after all, populated by what even the most enlightened called child races.
One of the most extraordinary consequences of the 1919 settlement was the mandate system, where the League of Nations mandated the major powers, particularly Britain and France, to take over areas of the Ottoman Empire and former German colonies and so on.
On January the 30th, 1919, the Supreme Council of the League agreed to the administration by advanced nations of those places inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, whose well-being was a sacred trust of civilization. And so was self-determination, a basic promise on President Wilson's agenda, accommodated. The British expected it to mean that the child races could choose whose arms they rushed into, and were alarmed. Mr. Spicer of the British Foreign Office said, "We cannot hope to take into the British sphere all the peoples of the world who would doubtless like to enter into it." The Chinese expected it to mean that they would get back Germany's Chinese territory of Shandong, but astonishingly, they did not.
China would hope to take back the previous concessions under German control, was now given to Japan. So the anti-Japanese sentiment was rising as well as the nationalist sentiment.
One of the consequences of the Paris Peace Conference in China was that it stimulated one of the most important student-driven political movements of the 20th century. One that actually gave rise to the birth of the Chinese Communist Party itself. And that took place on the 4th of May, 1919.
Historian Susan Pedersen described the League's mandate system as a program perfectly tailored to the task of rehabilitating the imperial order at its moment of greatest disarray. Wilfrid Scorn Blunt, poet, diplomat, explorer, and amorist, deplored the idea of mandates. He was opposed to Britain spreading what he called its debased industrialism, its crude cookery, and its flavorless religious creed. And the senescent British Empire did seem to be less top dog than baited bear. Nipped at by Ireland, Palestine, Iraq, India, Egypt, everywhere. Yet it remained the sole superpower as the USA withdrew into itself and Soviet Russia dealt with itself. One more illusion of an hallucinatory age. Writing Mein Kampf in 1923, Adolf Hitler would call the United Kingdom the greatest power on earth, which it was not.
There's no doubt that the major global empires, the British and the French Empire, very strong. They became larger after the end of the First World War. But in fact, that masked a fundamental weakness. They'd never really been prepared, either power, to put their money into defending those areas. There didn't seem to be a profound threat.
Well, little girl, it is finished. The President of the United States of America wrote to his wife at the conclusion of the Versailles Peace Conference. And as no one is satisfied, it makes me hope we have made a just peace. But it is all in the lap of the gods. But of course it was not. It was in the laps of men, including those who sat in the US Congress. President Wilson presented the text of the Versailles Treaty to the Senate on July the 10th. He said it was the hand of God who led us into this way, and he asked, dare we reject it and break the heart of the world? And the Senate answered, yes, we dare.
I think there were probably sufficient swing votes in the Senate that had Wilson been willing to compromise on some of these key issues, then he might well have got some sort of Senate agreement.
Wilson tried to shift American public opinion on a whistle-stop tour, but the strain broke him.
He took his campaign to the American people over the heads of Congress. He was going to persuade them by the force of his personality and the force of his ideals that this was going to be a good thing. And in the course of that, when he was in Colorado, he had severe headaches and then a terrible stroke.
When in November, the Senate put Versailles to the vote, rejected it, and spurned the League of Nations, the American president lay partially paralyzed in his bed.
My own view is that the treaty probably could have got through. The United States could have joined the League of Nations, but it was defeated by a combination of Republican intransigence and Wilson's own stubbornness. Now, if the United States had joined the League of Nations, we'll never know, but the history of the 1920s and 1930s might have been a bit different.
On September the 12th, Gabriella D'Annunzio and 1,000 followers seized the humble Adriatic town of Fiume, pledging to defend the city's Italian leader against the whimsical decision of the peacemakers who had tossed it to the newly minted Yugoslavia. When writer and poet Osbert Sitwell visited Fiume, he thought there was a chance that D'Annunzio, this frail little genius, he called him, might create an ideal land where the arts might flourish, an alternative to the choice between Bolshevism and American capitalism. A young newspaper editor decided he would create the third way. His name was Benito Mussolini, and in November he launched fascism.
Fascism is indeed and has been spoken about by historians as a third-wave phenomenon. Now, what do we mean by this? I mean, essentially, it's a revolutionary movement from the right. And in that respect, it pits fascism against communism, which is a revolution from the left. But of course, the really important X factor in the middle is the moribund liberal democracy.
Like Hitler in 1923, Mussolini's first foray into politics was a humiliating failure. Both men proved to be resilient. Elsewhere, the ninth of 13 children, the most celebrated sportsman of the age, the Manasseh Mauler, Jack Dempsey, was beating Jess Willard for the heavyweight crown.
The 70,000 spectators pack around the ring in the blistering sunshine. So the big fight begins. The mahogany-hued Dempsey circles, moving in and out with cat-footed quickness.
The champion lost a few teeth, suffered a broken jaw, broken cheekbone, and some broken ribs. The more powerful, but not the better man, won, said the Morning Herald. a slogan for the age.
The United States only officially becomes an urban nation in 1920. And that simply means that more than 50% of Americans in 1920 are living in towns larger than 2,000 people. And given that low threshold, it's still a rural society. Its cities are big, but most Americans are still living rurally on farms or in small towns.
Prohibition came to America on January the 16th, 1920. The first Prohibition Commissioner, John F. Kramer, confidently declaring that this law will be obeyed in cities large and small, and where it is not obeyed, it will be enforced. But enforcement relied on a small number of enforcement agents who paid $2,000 a year, were not immune from temptation. Except for Isidore Einstein, who would sally forth with old friend Moe Smith, equally unlikely, equally overweight, in any number of risible disguises to do battle with the bootleggers. The legend of the loved, feared, laughable Izzy and Moe was born. And a few more Izzies scattered over the country, wrote the Brooklyn Eagle, and the US would be bone dry, parched, and withered. 1920 was not a year when men like Izzy and Moe were appreciated. 1920 was a year when the world needed a drink. The impact of the worldwide depression of 1920 is widely understated. In Europe, Dr. Walter Rathenau, Weimar Minister for Reconstruction and later for Finance, was baffled. They write down noughts, and 9 noughts means a milliard. But no one can imagine a milliard. Does a wood contain a milliard leaves? Are there a milliard blades of grass in a meadow? Who knows? When those responsible for a nation's economy don't know, and Rathenau was one such, there are bound to be problems, and where. Germany was struggling to adjust to a peace treaty in which she had lost all of her colonies, her main sources of coal, zinc, potash, and iron ore, 15% of her wheat crop, 18% of potato cultivation, and all German capital held abroad. She'd lost 9/10 of her merchant fleet, which didn't just mean changing the flags on tramp steamers. Some of the most splendid ocean liners changed sides. The Imperator became Cunard's flagship Berengaria. The Bismarck sailed as the White Star Line's Majestic, and the Vaterland crossed the Atlantic as the Leviathan. Germany was also presented with a bill for reparations to pay the cost of the war.
Something that had been done over centuries. You'd make your enemy pay because you'd won, but the payment was classically fixed around the military cost. But the French and the British start to include all of these social costs. So they include the widows' pensions, which is something that always completely puzzled me when I was a student. I didn't understand why everybody was obsessed about these widows' pensions. Now I know it's because it cost an absolute packet.
On many important counts, Germany emerged better placed than Great Britain, where the cost of living by late 1920 had reached 3 times its pre-war level, where inflation was 22%, unemployment was over 11%, and the highest ever recorded, and the debt was enormous and inescapable. Whereas, as historian Niall Ferguson has pointed out, the Germans were more successful than any other country in defaulting on their debts. In such a climate, the cost of maintaining what Gibbon, the great historian of empire, called the arbitrary dominion of strangers, might have seemed prohibitive. But for France and Britain, the alternative, to retreat from empire, meant to surrender great power status. So they expanded their dominions.
What is to become of the Ottoman Empire? Who is going to get which piece of that territorial pie, if you like? Britain was to get control of what we would recognise today as Iraq and Jordan. France was to get control of what we recognise today as Syria and Lebanon. Roughly the area that we recognise today as the occupied Palestinian territories, and Israel was to become under the control of a sort of international condominium.
They were not supposed to be colonies, but the practice was that the British and the French treated these places as if they were part of their empire and painted them pink and green on the map and so on.
A road sign out in the desert tells us that 600 miles of burning sands are between here and romantic Baghdad. A Royal Air Force camp stands guard against raids by camel riders of the Arab tribes.
When the Arab tribes threatened trouble, Winston Churchill, as Secretary of State for War and Air, sent a memo to Hugh Trenchard, head of the Royal Air Force. "I think you should certainly proceed with the experimental work on gas bombs," Churchill wrote, "especially mustard gas, which would inflict punishment on recalcitrant natives without inflicting grave injury."
The expectation on the ground inside Egypt or Iraq or Syria is that they're on their way to nation statehood. But really, when you look at the British and the French, they don't see this happening anytime soon.
On July the 24th, 1920, the Sharifian forces battled some 80,000 French, mainly colonial Senegalese and Moroccan troops on the plains of Maysalan outside Damascus. Supported by aircraft and artillery, the French crushed those who opposed them. King Faisal fled, and another step was taken in creating the tortured patchwork inheritance of the Middle East. The neighboring British sphere of influence was similarly convulsed, and was only suppressed in November after extensive use of air power, and at a cost of £40 million. In 1920, to stabilize recalcitrant Iraq, the British sent in diplomat Sir Percy Cox, a man who could, it was said, keep silent in a dozen languages. Little wonder that in 1920, Photoplay magazine wrote an editorial imploring Charlie Chaplin to make a new film, because it said, "We are doleful and bewildered in a doleful and bewildered world."
Charlie Chaplin, who in 1914 is unknown, and by 1919 is the most famous person in the world.
Many people have tried to explain the appeal of The Little Tramp. I think Chaplin, because of his musical experience, had a very good rapport. He understood what people would be amused by and what they would be moved by.
The point about Chaplin was we would all like to kick the policeman. We would all like to kick the landlord.
In the aftermath of the war, Italy had multiple changes of government. 1919 and 1920 were known as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years. This paralysis of the established order created an opportunity that was seized by the fasci.
and it's a military term. It's about a bundle. It's also it's a formation of soldiers, a protective move of soldiers, becomes associated with a movement, a street movement. It's only from 1919 onwards that we start talking about fascism as the political movement.
Groups of fascists sprang up all over Italy. One, the Fasci del Combattimento, had been founded in 1919 by Benito Mussolini.
Italy was unusual in having an advanced peasant trade union, and after the First World War it became, for a while in 1919 and 1920, it managed to get quite a few gains in the pay and condition of Italian peasants. And fascism was designed to kill some of them, to give them castor oil, to humiliate them, to suppress people like that.
Soviet Russia, meanwhile, and mistakenly, thought it would make a grab for lands lost when it made peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. But Poland was no pushover, and Piłsudski's counterattack on the 15th, 16th of August smashed into 5 Soviet armies, destroyed 3 of them, and continued the rout until on August the 3rd, in Europe's last great cavalry battle at Zamość, 20,000 horsemen charged and countercharged in formation until the Polish uhlans swept the field. Lenin sued for peace, and the Treaty of Riga was signed in March 1921. It was not to be a lasting peace. In Russia, the civil war that had been tearing at the nation since the Bolsheviks took power. At 7 million, losses were 4 times greater than in the World War, was moving to a climax.
The Russian civil wars were a very messy set of affairs, with peasant uprisings, what we might call Greens, anarchist movements, blacks, anti-Russian nationalist movements.
On the 20th of October, General Nikolai Yudenich was advancing into the suburbs of Petrograd, Denikin driving north towards Moscow, and Kolchak advancing out of Siberia. Had they been united in their purpose, Bolshevism would have been doomed. They were not. It was not.
The ideology that the white movement formed was much weaker. They failed to communicate that ideology or their vision for the future of Russia to the wider population as well as the Bolsheviks had.
Trotsky managed to press 2 million men into the Red Army. By mid-November, the revolution had been saved. War, Trotsky said, is the locomotive of history.
Amidst the conflict, urban life began to collapse quite quickly. Major cities began to depopulate at extraordinary rates. People flee the cities, return to rural areas where they think they've a better chance of eking out a normal life.
Lenin learned, when he suppressed peasant unrest in 1921, that bullets do not fertilize the soil and terror does not make the wheat grow. In March, the new economic policy proved, if nothing else, that Lenin was pragmatist enough to correct his mistakes. A partial market economy was introduced, but it battled the cronyism and inefficiency that were already evident. By 1921, the Bolshevik bureaucracy was 10 times the size of the Tsar's and employed twice as many people as Soviet industry. In America, a different sort of fighting was out on the streets. where Tommy guns cost about $3,000 each in today's money, fired 800 rounds a minute and became known as Chicago typewriters. Prohibition inflated the cost of drinking as much as 20-fold, and fortunes were made and paid out. Captain Bill McCoy ran Caribbean rum along the eastern seaboard. Just one of the rum runners, but a man who gifted his name to the English language because of the quality of his contraband. It was the real McCoy. The best known of the gang bosses to trade in bootleg, Al Capone, had business cards that described him as a second-hand furniture dealer and a real sense of himself as a leading citizen. In the Depression, he organized a Chicago soup kitchen that cost him $300 a day. It was legal for doctors to prescribe liquor for medicinal purposes, and in 1921, 8 million gallons of medicinal whiskey were withdrawn from federal warehouses. The most common ailment, according to Wags, was thirstitis. When it came to electing their president, this America, described as a country impatient of problems too weighty for the mind in the street, chose a man who shrank from problems which he knew to be beyond his powers. "I don't seem to grasp that I am president," said President Warren Harding, who confessed, "I don't know anything about the European stuff."
Prohibition is here, and so is Warren Gamaliel Harding, elected president by a record majority on the slogan, "Back to normalcy." There is no such word as normalcy, but the people want it just the same.
America's conception of itself was still as a refuge from Europe, and when many Americans thought of Europe, they thought of intrigue with aristocrats and monarchs and leading their countries into bad wars, and America's mission was to stand apart from all that.
Modern America stood apart, some said on 3 pillars. The dollar, the movies, and jazz. Harlem's first jazz age hit was Shuffle Along, which featured an unknown Josephine Baker in the chorus. Jazz simply fit the times. The first great African-American poet, Langston Hughes, put it perfectly. "The rhythm of life is a jazz rhythm, honey." The jazz age was boisterous, nervous, scandalous. In Hollywood, scandal ended the career of a comedian whose popularity was second only to Chaplin's. A young actress died at a wild party. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was accused of her murder, tried and acquitted. One juror was moved to say that a gross injustice has been done to him. But the stories of how Virginia Rapp died persisted. Fake news. And Fatty Arbuckle was finished. On October the 4th, 1921, the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations assembled in Geneva for its first session. Lord Curzon described the Middle East Mandate as self-interest discreetly veiled by a facade of self-determination.
During the Cairo Conference of March 1921, Winston Churchill, colonial secretary by this stage, brings together military officials, colonial officials, interested parties. to literally sit down over the course of a conference to put all of their ideas on paper and to come up with the arrangements that will become the boundaries that we recognise today.
The British conceived a novel solution to the troubles in their Middle Eastern mandate.
Iraq is probably the most artificial of all the states that are created. Essentially, they are lumping together three very distinct provinces of Baghdad, Basra and Mosul. Three provinces that have existed in the Ottoman Empire but have never recognised themselves as affiliated in any sense. Britain essentially draws lines around those three provinces and says, you are now a single nation state.
The British offered the throne of Iraq to Faisal, recently tipped off the throne of Syria. On August the 23rd, 1921, Faisal was crowned king of Iraq. The war had been over for 3 years. The peacemakers had gone home. They had transformed the maps of Europe and the Middle East. In the Middle East, they had laid minefields, and Europe was unsettled, perhaps incendiary. Fascist power was not in the parliament. It was with the squadristi, the gangs of paramilitary thugs whose violence bullied peasants and townspeople into surrender. But in 1921, as junior members of a bloc put together by Italian Prime Minister Giovanni Giolotti to check the rise of the left, they entered the Italian parliament. Of them, Giolotti said, "The fascist candidates will be like fireworks. They will make a lot of noise, but will leave nothing behind except smoke." He was right, but they made more noise and for longer than he imagined. In August 1921, the Reparations Commission finally set the sum that Germany was required to pay. 226,000 million marks. The relationship between that announcement and the notorious hyperinflation that lay ahead was not the sum demanded, but the German government's plan for paying the bill, which was to print money.
An astounding paper chase in which you got paid your wages and you rushed out to spend them as quickly as you could, because by the time you got to the cafe where you were going to eat, they'd be worth half what they were when you were paid.
Officially, there was repeated denial of the possible link between the profligate printing of money and inflation, leading historians to wonder whether these people were stupid or if they had a plan to bring on a crisis that might provoke the Allies into cancelling reparations. What they brought on was a rise of political extremism. In August, Adolf Hitler, member number 555, took over leadership of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. "It makes no difference," Hitler said, "whether they laugh at us or revile us. The main thing is that they mention us." And he set course towards an unimaginable cataclysm. Two world wars tore the heart out of the 20th century. They are a rent in the fabric of history. When the First Great War ended, the world faced the challenge of making a lasting peace. At Versailles, in remaking the map, in reordering the world's economy, they fumbled and made an impossible peace. On February the 6th, 1922, at the Washington Naval Conference, a deal was struck that ended 3 months of debate about armament, disarmament, and rearmament.
For every 5 ships the United States and Great Britain had, Japan would have 3, and Italy and France would have 1.75 each. What was called the Rolls-Royce Ford ratio.
By such shaky steps might peace be maintained, if it was given a chance. On the morning of June the 24th, 1922, Walter Rathenau, a dominant and sensible minister of Weimar, set off for work from his villa in the Berlin suburb of Grunwald. The weather was fine, so he instructed his chauffeur to use the open-top limousine. And, alone in the back, he was gunned down by anti-Republican nationalists.
Although it's probably the most famous of these assassinations, it's not the only assassination of a moderate centrist or left-wing figure in the early years of the Weimar Republic. There is a concerted campaign of right-wing terrorism really from 1919 until 1921, 22, 23. And in some ways, I think Rathenau's significance is almost bound up with his assassination and his death.
In the subsequent Reichstag debate, the Chancellor, Joseph Wirth, caused uproar by accusing the right-wing press of inciting the murder. "There stands the enemy," he called across the chamber, "and there is no doubt about it. The enemy is on the right." With violence becoming commonplace, political murders in the hundreds, Germany, a unified nation for less than half a century, was at risk of disintegration. The political scene, rallies, street demonstrations, and paramilitary turnouts that first lifted Hitler to prominence were fractious and feverish because living was descending into chaos. Food prices increased almost 8-fold between 1918 and 1921. In 1922, they increased 130-fold. When numbers are so fantastic, unreality permeates everything. Everyone is liable to follow Alice through the looking glass. Thus, the Bavarian Parliament, with its deficit doubling in 1922, and having not a clue how to deal with massive tax liabilities, voted to double its annual grant encouraging gymnastics. In the whole course of history, said British Ambassador Lord Davenant of the Reichsbank's reckless money printing, no dog has ever run after its own tail with the speed of the Reichsbank. A policy described by Joseph Addison of the British Embassy in Berlin as the daily creation of fresh paper money. Things were worse in Austria, where by the end of August, the krone hit 350,000 to the pound and was still untethered. Allowed to survive with its elegant capital as the barely viable rump of a once tremendous empire, Austria comprised, in the words of historian Adam Ferguson, a few million bankrupt, hungry people floundering about on a map they did not recognize. Dr. Siepel, the Chancellor, addressed the League of Nations and made clear that unless help was forthcoming, Austria would be obliged to surrender some of her autonomy. Help forthcame. The Geneva Protocol for the reconstruction of Austria was signed on October the 4th. Prices began to fall. The value of the krona stabilized. Such things were possible. But not universal. In Italy, between 1920 and 1921, there had been a 500% increase in unemployment and a 50% hike in prices. In 1922, Mussolini took power. He did not seem to have a particular plan. In September, he confessed that our program is simple. We want to govern Italy. And that pretty much was the entire program.
What starts in Italy is something that looks very, very small. A small group of activists led by a maverick come to power. They have no programmatic document. They have no equivalent of Mein Kampf. And in fact, even the declarations by Mussolini don't help either. I mean, Mussolini famously has said that fascism is action.
Mussolini did not seize power by marching on Rome. History and King Victor Emmanuel were misinformed.
There's a sort of military-ish coup in the sense that armed fascists march on the capital city, Rome. They don't really get there, but they march towards it. It rains heavily and the maps are poor. It's not quite clear whether the army's going to resist them or something or other.
Rome is defended by soldiers and barbed wire. The king is asked to declare martial law. That means fighting and bloodshed, and the king refuses. He will permit no civil war. He telegraphs Mussolini to come and take the government.
Mussolini arrived on an overnight train from Milan. Mussolini, according to A.J.P. Taylor, entered his sleeping car in a black shirt and stepped out in a top hat and tailcoat. What Taylor characterized as a parable of the variations between respectability and revolution that he maintained thereafter.
And then the fascists come into Rome and actually commit a few murders and beat up the socialists they can find and sack their newspaper offices and do all those sort of fascist things.
The legendary March on Rome had an official death toll of 3. So why do I insist on proclaiming that October was historically a revolution? Asked Mussolini. Because words have their own tremendous magic power, he answered. He led a coalition government which included only 4 fascist ministers, including himself.
Once he becomes Prime Minister, almost all of respectable Italy rallies behind his coalition government. It's approved by the King, obviously, it's approved by the Vatican, it's approved by Italian industry and commerce, it's approved by the large landowners, it's approved by Freemasonry.
I think the prevalent feeling was that Mussolini could be controlled. So he could perhaps promote the rule of law and law and order and crack down on any dissent. But I don't think that any of the people who are at the decision-making table calculate that things are going to go where they end up going.
Britain had been, at least the City of London had been, banker to the world. Sterling was the reserve currency, and it was a matter unanimously agreed in the city that a return to the pound's pre-war relationship to gold was fundamental to the recovery of that cherished position. Devaluation would have made exports more competitive and carried other benefits, but confidence and prestige would have suffered. Choosing deflation, the Bank of England increased interest rates to 7% in 1920. and threw 2 million people out of work. Still, 1922 was, according to writer and critic Cyril Connolly, the annus mirabilis of the modern movement. Except for the Dadaists, who suffered a terminal falling out. According to Theo van Doesburg, the group of artist-anarchist revolutionaries clashed over whether a locomotive was more modern than a bowler hat. More enduringly, Ulysses, generally voted the most significant novel of the 20th century, was published in 1922. But the island that James Joyce, its expatriate author, so lovingly detailed, was no more.
Even though about 150,000 Irishmen had fought in the Great War, in Ireland there was a very significant political movement calling itself Sinn Féin, which wanted nothing to do with the Great War, had nothing to do with the Great War, and instead had allegiance to a republic which had been proclaimed in 1916.
Ireland's War of Independence had ended, and a civil war followed.
After the Irish Civil War and the granting of limited independence in 1922, Ireland was still viewed by the British as a kind of, as a lost dominion.
For most people, it was not violence that was transforming daily life. It was progress. Church attendance fell as automobilists, as they were called, day excursionists, drove out of town and, to give their journeys some point, pursued a new interest, which was reflected in 1922 when The Car magazine changed its name to Car and Golf.
By 1922, 1923, a run of prosperity begins. And I think this is the moment when the power of American industry and manufacturing in the United States and the world becomes apparent. Washing machines, refrigerators appear for the first time, millions of cars on the road.
Mass production is Main Street's inspiration. Folks who don't even own a bathtub own a Model T, a Tin Lizzie. After all, you can't drive into town in a bathtub.
If the car was left in the garage and the family remained at home, there was a new marvel to entertain. During 1922, the number of American radio stations grew from 28 to 570, and movie-going was a universal pastime.
It's a misnomer to assume that silent cinema, as we call it, was watched in silence. It was a babel of noise, not just perhaps the honky-tonk piano twiddling away somewhere, but the fact that children who grew up in, shall we say, in America, and who had learned English virtually from birth or were going to school, would actually translate the titles to their parents in Italian or more frequently in Yiddish.
On August the 14th, 1922, a man who had, in his day, been a candidate for most powerful person in England, died. He had been amongst the first to realize the potential influence of the popular press. But Lord Northcliffe spent his final weeks raving mad in a hutch on the roof of a house in Carlton Gardens belonging to the Duke of Devonshire, which also seems like a parable of the times. On January the 9th, 1923, with Britain dissenting, the French, Belgian, and Italian members of the Reparation Commission agreed that Germany was in default. Specifically, it had failed to make an in-kind reparations payment to France of 100,000 telegraph poles. Under the terms of treaties and settlements galore, This was a trigger for French occupation of the Ruhr, which her belligerent premier, Raymond Poincaré, had foreshadowed to the British Prime Minister several weeks earlier. It was an act which was to double Germany's budget deficit. Lloyd George called the French move an act of military aggression against an unarmed nation. General de Gaulle led 5 French and 1 Belgian divisions, 60,000 men, into the Ruhr on January the 11th. They occupied the region in which were 85% of Germany's coal resources, 80% of her steel and pig iron production, and 10% of her population, who promptly downed tools. On January the 16th, the government in Berlin announced its official support for non-cooperation in the Ruhr.
Germany was in a very bad way indeed. There'd been an attempt by the French and the Belgians to extract reparations from Germany. The German government had reacted by they didn't call it that then, but a policy of passive resistance. And it had destroyed the German economy, and German inflation was absolutely wild.
The Reichsmark plunged from 7,260 to the dollar to 49,000 to the dollar. Within 3 weeks of the invasion, the Reichsbank had issued its first million-mark note. At the end of July, the German people found themselves folding 10, 20, and 50 million-mark notes. And with ridiculous predictability, on August the 22nd, the first 100 million-mark note was issued as hyperinflation stripped the currency of all value. By autumn, the non-cooperation policy could not be sustained. It collapsed in ignominious acquiescence as the newspaper Kölnische Zeitung, price 5 million marks, of September the 30th, published the oath of service to the French and Belgians that German workers were being compelled to swear. To see for himself whether it was true that there was food in the country which the farmers were not sending to the towns, Joseph Addison, councillor at the British Embassy, left Berlin. But when he tried to buy an egg from a country dweller, he was told, "Wir wollen keine Judenfetzen von Berlin." We don't want any Jewish confetti from Berlin. In the first 6 months of 1923, about 17 trillion marks were printed. It involved, according to one estimate, the output of more than 30 paper mills, 150 printing firms, and 2,000 printing presses. As the money flooded the country, the greatest inflation in history elevated the exchange rate stratospherically. From 620,000 marks to the dollar in August 1923 to 630 billion 3 months later, by which time a kilo of butter cost 250 billion marks. People walked along the street pushing prams full of banknotes, and if one blew away, no one chased it. The price of a cup of coffee on the Unter den Linden might double between placing the order and adding the sugar. Petty thieves were tipping banknotes from people's baskets and trolleys and stealing the baskets. As the mark sailed past 60 milliard to the pound, the British ambassador was pleased to observe that this was approximately 1 mark for every second that has elapsed since the birth of Christ. The number of banknotes in circulation is better written than spoken. On November the 5th, the price of a 2-kilogram loaf of bread vaulted from 20 billion to 140 billion marks, and there were nationwide riots. Berlin, once so proudly and antiseptically clean, was looking grubby. A stone grey corpse, according to artist George Gross. And into all of this, at least into the Birke Braukeller, strode Adolf Hitler. It was November the 8th, 1923. Armed stormtroopers entered the building, and their leader, Adolf Hitler, fired 2 shots into the air and announced that the revolution had begun. The next day, November the 9th, 1923, Hitler and 3,000 supporters marched through Munich, planning to link up with Erich Röhm and his mob. Their way was blocked. Shots from the Munich police defending the Odeonplatz were enough to bring the intended coup to a spluttering end. 21 people were killed, and Adolf Hitler's revolution ended as quickly as it had begun. He was arrested, and the printing presses continued to roll. 74 million marks a week, and the 100 billion mark note went safely into circulation. By the time Hitler was released from the Landsberg prison, support for the Völkisch Bloc had collapsed. Not because of Hitler's absence, but because of Germany's recovery. Spearheaded by the Dawes Plan and the issue of a new currency, the Rentenmark.
It was private bankers that helped stabilize the German economy, and private bankers gave Germany its seal of approval. And because interest rates were higher in Germany than they were in the United States, this encouraged a flow of capital from the United States to Germany.
The finance minister, Dr. Luther, likened the issue of the Rentenmark to building a house starting with the roof. Confidence was all. Hjalmar Schacht, head of the Reichsbank, and later an important player in the Third Reich economy, transformed chaos into something that at least promised order. He did it, his secretary Fraulein Steffert said, by reading no letters and writing no letters. He telephoned a great deal, telephoned in every direction, and he smoked. Apart from that, he did nothing. Japan's recovery had been more disciplined and altogether more effective. The economy had almost dragged the yen back to its pre-war rate against the dollar. When, just before lunchtime, on September the 1st, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake subjected Tokyo, Yokohama, and surrounding areas to almost 5 minutes of shaking, with an energy release equivalent to some 400 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. Followed by a tsunami 11 meters in height.
Japan, the land of the cherry blossom and the geisha, but always living under the shadow of nature's most dreaded manifestation. The Japanese view the wreckage with a stoicism almost unbelievable to the Western mind.
Soon small fires merged to form a firestorm. By the morning of September the 3rd, at least 140,000 people were dead, and 2/3 of Tokyo and 4/5 of Yokohama were ashes.
The capital area around Tokyo, its main port of Yokohama, were hit by what has certainly been the most devastating earthquake that Japan has faced in its modern history. It had a number of sort of longer-term consequences. It increased the power temporarily of the military. It affected longer-term thinking about how to cope with disaster, and disaster included attack by other countries. And it did influence the way in which new prime ministers were chosen.
A correspondent from an Osaka newspaper flying over Tokyo's ruins in an open cockpit army reconnaissance plane, observed that even at a height of 1,000 meters, the disagreeable and unmistakable odor of death overpowered the smell of engine exhaust. Much of urban Japan was knocked down, and within 3 months, Japan had been forced to seek a loan, taking one organized through J.P. Morgan at the punitive rate of 6.5%.
At some levels, it fed into longer-term economic woes, which, without doubt, laid fertile ground for the political trends that emerged, particularly in the 1930s.
President Warren Harding, who had been elected to preside over the peace in the most sweeping presidential victory in history, was classed by his own party as not a first-rater. And a Democratic opponent said that his speeches leave the impression of an army of pompous phrases moving across the landscape in search of an idea. He was also a serial womanizer, which may or may not have contributed to the heart attack that killed him. He was succeeded by the Vice President, Calvin Coolidge.
Calvin Coolidge symbolises the period, I think, very much so. Silent Cal, who was well known for not being drawn in conversation, would just like to sort of sit there and have a quiet time and just let everything else unfold around him.
America in the 20s did not have paramilitary fascist street fighters like the gangs that transformed German and Italian politics. But one organization that had almost faded out did enjoy a revival. The Ku Klux Klan had nearly 1 million members by 1923. And at $3 million, an annual income that matched that of Al Capone's empire. Despite being, in the view of William Allen White, a self-constituted body of moral idiots, the Klan, whose original appeal and action was more anti-Catholic than anti-black, touched something in American society. Not a nerve, but a nervousness about a loss of identity, of Americanism. What most inspired membership of the Klan was the seriously held, seriously clownish belief that the Catholic Church was plotting to install the Pope in the White House. And "the Pope will sit in the White House when hell freezes" was a popular slogan. The America of the biggest cities was a very different place. When young Duke Ellington arrived in New York for the first time in 1923, he exclaimed, "Why, it's just like the Arabian Nights." It was the bright lights of department stores.
The jewel and the crown of a large city's downtown section would be the department store.
The appeal of window shopping, the beginnings of fashion as an industry for everyone.
And so for the first time, by about 1922-23, you can compare perhaps a flesh-toned silk satin rayon dress by Chanel with the cheapest level of production that would cost just a few shillings.
These were basic consumer goods that gave the ordinary man or woman a little bit of a pick-me-up. Let them step through that portal of consumer society by buying a china elephant for their knick-knack show.
Mussolini was shopping for an empire. On August the 31st, Italian troops landed on Corfu. He called the invasion peaceful and provisional. A description that seems absurd now, and must have seemed so then. After 15 days and the first fascist essay in territorial aggrandizement, Italy withdrew from Corfu. And in one of history's typical and pleasing ironies, Italy sponsored Ethiopia's application to join the League of Nations in 1923. As the leaves started to fall, it seemed that so many competing tensions across the European continent must lead to a calamity of some sort. Communist coup, fascist coup, German disintegration, military intervention. In Spain, in a pronunciamiento, the Captain General of Catalonia, with the King's support, made himself dictator.
This great social tension led in September of 1923 to the establishment of a dictatorship. And the dictator, in many ways, was, if you like, the perfect Praetorian Guard for those sectors of Spanish society that felt threatened.
The dictator was Miguel Primo de Rivera. King Alfonso XIII later called him my Mussolini. In Russia, in the winter of 1923-4, as Lenin neared death, figures shuffled impatiently, ready to step into the light. Trotsky, hero of the Red Army because of his role in the 1921 victory in the Civil War. Zinoviev, head of the Comintern. And Bukharin, the revolution's leading theorist. The succession would fall on none of them. Deeper in the shadows stood a man who had been in the Tsarist equivalent of the Gulag. Not as a political martyr, but as a bank robber. His party name was Joseph Stalin.
As General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party, Stalin had enormous patronage opportunities. As the General Secretary, he was in charge of the mechanisms of appointing key people to key posts across the Soviet Union.
Do you know, said Britain's ambassador after first meeting Stalin, I think the chap's a gentleman. Calvin Coolidge was elected in his own right in 1924. The slogan that carried the day was, Coolidge or chaos.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom.
Coolidge believed that the less government, the better. And he aspired, in Irving Stone's words, to become the least president the country had ever had. Coolidge possessed what one writer described as God-given inertia. And a famed riposte, reportedly by Dorothy Parker, could stand as an indictment of Coolidge's presidency. On being told in 1933 that Coolidge had died, she is said to have asked, "How can you tell?" In Europe, the threat of chaos seemed more present than in America. In France, the franc, which had traded at 93 to the pound, by April 25th had dropped to 164, and by July 26th, to 243, which had a savage effect on French government spending. But it was deliciously appealing to expats on tight budgets, and they poured in. In the Italian election of April 1924, Mussolini's bloc, by now dominated by the fascists, won 375 of the 535 seats. Giacomo Matteotti, the leader of the socialists, protested the legitimacy of the result. He disappeared and was later found murdered. In repressive actions that followed, in Mussolini's own words, the foundations of the totalitarian state were laid.
The socialist trade unions, they become illegal. The newspapers are more and more censored. Their editors are replaced, and instead of having some editor who might be a critic of Mussolini, you get editors who will always toady and express enthusiasm.
Mussolini was one of the most wonderful men of our times, according to Winston Churchill's wife. Pope Pius XI called him the man whom Providence has sent us. Steps were, meanwhile, and at last, being taken to stabilize Germany's economy. Compromise, the election of Gustav Stresemann, and a committee set up to re-examine the issue of reparations under American banker Charles Dawes looked for a way forward.
There is an effort by this Republican administration to try and help Europe back on its feet. The Dawes Plan and the Young Plans of the 1920s are an effort to revive the European economy, which had obviously been hugely disrupted by the war.
Constructive diplomacy in one part of the world was offset by prejudice in another. 1919's Paris settlement had rejected Tokyo's proposal racial equality clause. In 1921, Britain chose not to renew the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And in 1924, the United States Congress enacted legislation excluding Japanese from immigration quotas. The stage was set for an upsurge in Japanese nationalism, for the emergence of a new class the Japanese called double patriots. But it was in Russia that the most significant event happened. When Lenin died on January the 22nd, an immortalization commission was set up, which, in contravention of the widow's wishes, decided to mummify the leader. He remains on display almost a century later, but that, of course, does not make him immortal. Neither does it make him a saint. Stalin inherited a fully formed terror state. He ramped up the scale of its oppression, but the machinery was there and ticking over. Lenin had built it, yet Manning Clark, long the doyen of Australian historians, was able to find Lenin Christ-like, at least in his compassion. Similar claims would be made for his successor, but not by Trotsky, who in 1924 wrote, "He is needed by all of them, all the sneaks that are crawling out of the upturned soil of the revolution. Stalin will become the dictator of the USSR." It was not only totalitarian regimes that employed institutional violence. This was a world in which men could get away with statements that would now lead to crucifixion on social media. We presume in South Africa that white civilization must be the guiding influence. Gisbert Hofmeyr, administrator of Southwest Africa, told the League of Nations Mandate Commission in 1924. And the Syro-Palestinian Congress wrote to the President of the Fifth Assembly of the League on September the 17th, 1924, arguing that their lands could not be placed alongside Cameroon, Togo, and other savage countries in justifying Western rule. Racism is colorblind. Hitler was released into this rather topsy-turvy world on the 20th of December. He had 333 days of his sentence still to serve. Had he spent those days in prison, this might be a very different story. The Charleston arrived in England in 1925. The eponymous melody was composed by an African-American pianist named James P. Johnson for the Broadway show Running Wild. The reliably noxious Daily Mail likened it to Negro orgies. But bright young things weren't about to be deterred. It swept Britain as it had swept the States, and it became, and it remains, the emblem of an age. Motifs of racial theory, social Darwinism, and the faux science of eugenics weave like a toxic thread through the era, buttressing the exceptionalist attitude that validated the idea of empire.
Oldest city in the world that is still standing. Damascus was ancient when the Apostle Paul departed through that eastern gate to sally forth and give Christianity to the Gentile world.
To the French, for example, the Syrian revolt of 1925 was the work of brigands. But to the Syrians, it was a response to a system in which every petty local official needed French approval for every action. Where officers who had served in the Ottoman army were forced to accept commissions of a lower rank, and where pegging the local currency to the franc led inevitably to inflation and distress.
By 1923, 1924, disillusion is very, very substantial. And by 1925, you start to see armed risings taking place in Syria against French rule. The Great Syrian Revolt breaks out in those years in the Jabal Druze, the Druze Mountains.
The revolt against French rule found the whole of Syria was dry kindling. On August the 23rd, styling himself commander of the Syrian revolutionary armies, Al-Atrash issued a general call to arms. The story takes a predictable course. Druze and Bedouin fighters hammered by aircraft and tanks.
The suppression of these revolts is, how shall I put this? The revolts are suppressed with force.
Less predictably, the bombing of Damascus led to an international outcry and a crisis for the League of Nations mandate system. Here was a turning point. How could violence, used to control the child races, be reconciled with attacks on ancient civilized and biblical places? Bomb Damascus?
What also happens at the Permanent Mandates Commission is that as they develop their rules for running the mandates, they create an amazing forum for press, for publicity, for lobbying, for complaint. And the bombing of Damascus in 1925 and 1926 is a great example of this.
Outrage was easily hosed down. When the Permanent Mandates Commission concluded its inquiry, France's representative, Decay, could with some satisfaction report to his masters at the Quai d'Orsay an agreement that neither the mandate nor the choice of mandatory was up for discussion. In fact, The inquiry had refused to hear from Syrian representatives who had travelled to give evidence.
Hindsight is a luxury, but I really struggle sometimes to understand how they possibly thought what they were doing was ever going to end well.
On May the 30th, in the same spirit, British police opened fire on a patriotic demonstration in Shanghai, killing 12 and wounding scores. The early death of the Republic's most prominent leader, like other untimely deaths in the period, was destabilizing.
Sun Yat-sen had become quite ill, and he was very politically isolated by the 1920s. When he died in 1925, his position as leader of China's nationalist revolution was taken up by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, why should someone like Chiang Kai-shek have come to power? The reason is that, essentially, he understood military tactics. It may have been his rival, Mao, who later said that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. But Chiang Kai-shek was one of the first figures to learn that lesson.
At least the Europeans were making an effort to get on with each other. The terms of a crucial Franco-German détente were spelled out in the Treaty of Locarno, signed on October the 16th. Those terms had been agreed by the foreign ministers Briand of France, Stresemann of Germany, and Austin Chamberlain of Great Britain, during a 5-hour cruise across Lake Maggiore aboard the Orange Blossom. They saw Germany rehabilitated as an equal partner. A little under a year later, she was to join the League of Nations, thanks to Stresemann's pragmatism.
He recognized that simply denying the treaty, as so many Germans wanted, was a path to nowhere. And so what he did was open relations, improve relations with France, with Britain, and there were these very famous agreements that were negotiated.
This reconciliation was engineered against the backdrop of growing extremism in Germany, on both left and right. In 1923, there were only 71 Nazi groups outside of Bavaria. In 1925, there were 262. And Hitler commissioned his photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, to take a series of posed portraits of him gesticulating. And looking at these, and we must suppose a mirror, whilst listening to a recording of one of his speeches, he rehearsed his effects. It was calculated charisma, but had he need of it? He jumps to his feet, and there he is, shakes my hand like an old friend, and those big blue eyes like stars. He is glad to see me. I am in heaven. So wrote Joseph Goebbels in his diary. It was November 1925, and he had just met Adolf Hitler.
Wir Jungen, Heil! Heil!
2 world wars tore the heart out of the 20th century. They are a rent in the fabric of history. The world lurched into the tear with high hopes and mixed feelings. But as the 20s went on, some knew that careless optimism was leading to a terrible crash and an impossible peace. As Paris lurched into 1929, it seemed on the surface, for those with long pockets, that the party would go on. The American writer Robert McAlmon was there, surrounded by artists and writers and hangers-on. He glimpsed beneath the gloss with rare perception. They're wraiths, all of them, McAlmon said. They aren't people. God knows what they've done with their realities.
This is a new day. All gods are dead, all wars fought, and all faiths shaken, according to Scott Fitzgerald.
On October the 3rd, 1929, Gustav Stresemann, the Chancellor and a level-headed hope for the success of the Weimar Republic, suddenly died, plunging Germany's future into uncertainty.
During his lifetime, he was lauded abroad and hated at home in many ways. But I think, at the very least, his significance is that he's a great pragmatist.
Once he is gone, there's a kind of precarious void, really, that happens. And that's when we get also into these kind of sequences of the abuse of executive powers and the change of chancellors that never really stops until Hitler is appointed.
In its obituary, the Times said of Stresemann that because of his leadership, Germany is now prospering and has an important place in the affairs of Europe. Stresemann knew better. Just before his death, he said that the German economy is doing well only on the surface. Germany is in fact dancing on a volcano. If the short-term loans are called in by America, Stresemann said, most of our economy will collapse. And because of the Wall Street crash, that is exactly what happened. Soviet Russia's autarky quarantined it from the worst of the global depression, but not from misery. In the first 3 years of Stalin's 5-year plan, beginning in 1929, the population of Moscow grew by 50%, swollen by 26 million peasants who voluntarily, under duress, shifted, creating the proletariat the revolution needed to fulfill the Marxist prediction.
Arguably, the October Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was not the most important event in the first 20 or 30 years of the 20th century, because the majority of the population, their life didn't change much.
Peasants were now toiling in factories. In 1929, the Red Army had 90 tanks. 4 years later, it had 4,700.
The major change came with collectivization, forced collectivization, and the rapid industrialization after 1929.
On the 21st of December, Joseph Stalin celebrated his 50th birthday and the birth of an unparalleled cult of personality.
Stalin is an immensely slippery figure. Just as you start to think you understand Stalin and what's going on, he slips through your fingers and he shifts and he shapeshifts again.
Italy also promoted a cult of personality, but its hero was obliged to seek an accommodation with the old centers of power.
Mussolini doesn't enjoy absolute power in Italy, so the king is still in place, will remain in place until Mussolini is ousted from power. And there's also the Catholic Church, led by the Pope, who are autonomous and exert quite a lot of influence on Italian society.
Early in 1929, protocols were signed at the Lateran Palace, defining and formalizing the relationship between fascist Italy and the Vatican.
The historic document was signed at the Lateran by the Duce and Cardinal Gaspari, the Papal Secretary of State. The Treaty of the Lateran means much for internal peace and harmony in Italy.
By the Lateran Pact, fascism made Catholicism the official state religion. But the Church gave away more. It made fascism the state, and in a referendum on March the 24th, more than 8.5 million Italians voted yes in support of the regime. Only 135,000 voted no. Mussolini was now Prime Minister and also head of 8 ministries. There was no personality cult in Britain, which had always found ordinary people more appealing. Stanley Baldwin's government campaigned under perhaps the least inspiring political slogan ever promoted: safety first. It was the first election in which all women aged over 21 were able to vote. It was nicknamed the Flapper election, and Safety First lost out to Labour's promise, "We can conquer unemployment," which they couldn't. In December, 2 motions were put at the annual conference of the Indian National Congress. One was a modest demand for Dominion status, backed by veteran Congress member Motilal.
In 1929, there is this Congress held, and there the tension really explodes. Motilal Nehru and Gandhi say, India should move by steps to greater self-government by first gaining Dominion status, like the white settler colonies of Australia and New Zealand and Canada.
The second motion was a ferocious demand for independence now, jointly sponsored by Subhas Bose and Motilal's son, Jawaharlal Nehru, who would become India's first Prime Minister.
The younger generation, Nehru and Bose, say, the time for that is over. Now we want Swaraj, which meant full independence. The phrase was Purna Swaraj, full independence.
So the future was stirring in some parts of the world, and the past hanging on in others. A drenching from a big burst bubble was threatening the global economy, and the 20s were done. The Flapper era ends, wrote Wallace Stegner, a Harvard academic and journalist, in grimness, bewilderment, and anger. British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald was starting to show the signs of mental collapse that would cause a contemporary to recall that when he rose to speak in Parliament, no one knew what he was going to say, and when he did say it, nobody understood it. In 1930, the British Prime Minister wrote, "My head won't work." Other countries were also in less than reliable hands. Spain was drifting into a republic phase in the wake of the dictatorship from 1923 to 1930 of Primo de Rivera, a military man whose adroitness as a ruler was perhaps best assessed by his remark that, "Had I known in my youth that I would one day have to govern this country, I would have spent more time studying and less fornicating." In Germany's 1928 election, the right-wing parties had lost ground, and the Nazis attracted a paltry 2.6% of the popular vote. But disaster was just around the corner. a moderate coalition ceased to function and power shifted to the president. Paul Ludwig Hans Anton von Beneckendorf und von Hindenburg. In March, Hindenburg, relying on Clause 48 of the Weimar Constitution, appointed Germany's first presidential cabinet. In the June state election in Saxony, Nazi support jumped to 14%. The party's focus had shifted from the crude anti-Semitic tirades of the early 20s to the urgent need for Lebensraum and complaint about the shambles of Weimar democracy, which only National Socialism could solve. How? Didn't matter. It just could.
It was, I regret to say, the fascist leaders who understood the power of film. It was people like Mussolini, it was people like Oswald Mosley in England, and above all, it was Hitler in Germany. They understood how important it was to communicate with people, to give a theatrical performance.
In one day, the National Socialists advanced from 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats to 18.3% and 107 seats. The day was September the 14th, 1930. Almost 6.5 million Germans voted for Hitler. In the main, the vote had swung across from the bourgeois parties of the centre and the right. Roughly a quarter of those who voted Nazi had never voted before. Confronted by Hitler's success, money panicked, and about half of Germany's currency reserves went flying out of the country.
It's often been said that a lot of the people who later become Nazis are not the generation who fight during the First World War in Germany, but the generation who are just too young to have seen combat.
On December the 5th, All Quiet on the Western Front had its German premiere at the Mozart Hall in Berlin. Barely 10 minutes after it had begun, the performance was interrupted when the National Socialist propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels walked noisily out of the theatre. This was the signal for Nazi activists in the audience to release white mice, stink bombs, and itching powder into the crowded auditorium. Fights broke out, with the thugs unimaginatively chanting, "Jews out! Jews out!" and screeching, "Judenfilm!" On December the 11th, the Supreme Film Censorship Board revoked its decision to pass the film on the grounds that it was detrimental to German prestige. Frank Pease, president of the Hollywood Technical Directors Association, agreed with Goebbels and also called for All Quiet on the Western Front to be banned. It will, he said, go far to raise a race of yellow streaks, slackers, and disloyalists. But the threat to American society came not from an anti-war novel, whose author, incidentally, was Catholic, not Jewish, but from an economic disaster that was starting to infect every industrial power and would become the badge of the decade.
It's with the coming of the Depression, I think, that people start to feel that they're living in a pre-war era rather than a post-war era.
Liberalism comes under huge attack, of course, after the 1929 economic crisis, when the economic aspect of that edifice comes crashing down, and then the masks fall.
One of the things that happens as a result of the Depression after the Wall Street crash, of course, is that every government thinks to itself, what's my priority? My priority is trying to make things better for my population.
In 1930, 44% of the American population was still classified as rural. More than 45 million were without indoor plumbing, and almost all of the rural population was without electricity. In November 1930, the farmer who received $1.35 a bushel for his wheat last year now got 75 cents. And it had been a searing summer of drought, so he had little to sell in any case.
Staggering damages to crops have been suffered in Kansas and other wheat states, where grains have been stunted and literally burnt up by the successive weeks of blistering heat. Day after day, a blazing sun has resulted in midget stalks that may never bear. Heat deaths, too, are mounting daily. Water is being hauled for miles to many farms in a desperate effort to save a part of the crop. But the toll in ruined farms is the worst in the history of the nation.
Bank closures in the month set a new mark, 236. The record would not survive. In December, 328 went under.
Small banks can't have a diverse portfolio. If you have a small bank in the middle of the corn belt, the banker looks out of his window, all he sees is corn. People coming in to borrow money from him or grow corn. Now, if the price of corn collapses, he's in trouble.
The response to the crisis was more knee-jerk than well considered. And President Hoover could not rein in the excesses of Congress in applying 1930's Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, erecting forbidding barriers to trade.
The most notorious piece of legislation passed in the Herbert Hoover period is the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which massively raises tariffs, which is an effort to try and protect the American home market, but all it really does is spark retaliation from a European bloc, a British Empire bloc. And so you're getting then very early on a huge trade war.
And that was precisely the wrong move to make at a time when trade is faltering, exchange is faltering, people are buying much less in terms of production. Putting in a strong protectionist law, which is then going to trigger retaliatory measures from other countries, has the effect of putting not just the American economy, but the entire Western world's economy into nosedive.
Smoot-Hawley, signed into law on June the 17th, 1930, raised US tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Henry Ford called it economic stupidity, and more than 1,000 economists signed a petition asking the president to veto the bill. The value of European exports to the US was $1,334 million in 1929. In 1930, it was $390 million. Retaliatory tariffs impacted on trade in the other direction. US exports to Europe fell from $2,341 million in 1929 to $784 million in 1932. Hoover signing Smoot-Hawley into law was seen as the moment in which, according to political writer Walter Lippmann, he surrendered everything for nothing. He accepted a mischievous product of stupidity and greed. Why did he sign?
I think he was a good president. His problem was that he was president when the Great Depression hit. And he, like many others, didn't know really what to do. You know, should they cut taxes? Was that the way to try and get the economy going again? Should they put up trade barriers? Congress was certainly pushing for trade barriers to try and protect American industries and American production. And I think Hoover, like a lot of people, didn't know what to do. And he really floundered.
Smoot-Hawley did not arrest the slide into depression. Ford cut its working week from 5 days to 3, and the lights went out on neighborhood banks.
There was a dispute over a mortgage, and Mrs. Grace Jones and her family find themselves in the open. But they're not discouraged and carry on just as though they had walls surrounding them.
Hoover described the American banking system as the element most sensitive to fear. It was never a robust system. with an average of 500 failures a year throughout the 1920s. But in 1930, fear stumbled towards panic. And in the last 60 days of 1930, 600 banks closed their doors, 1,352 for the year. It has to be understood that of America's 25,000 banks, only 751 had branches. The others were, according to Carter Glass, Woodrow Wilson's Treasury Secretary, run by little corner grocery men calling themselves bankers. If the scale of the Depression was seismic, its effect logically depended on the strength of the structures it shook. And across Europe, these were far from robust. Revolving door governments, military takeovers, and authoritarian regimes controlled countries from the Baltic to the Balkans. By December, industrial production had fallen by 30% in the USA, 25% in Germany, 30% in Britain. 5 million were unemployed in America, 4.5 million in Germany, 2 million in Britain.
The 1929 crisis shatters the belief in the ability of a liberal economic system based on mobility and trade to sustain itself. In fact, it plays in the hand of the enemies of liberalism, both on the left and the right.
Countries are in terrible debt because they are owing money that they owe probably even from before the period of the Depression. But now, in the Depression, the creditors are coming and they want their money. And you have to pay. So cuts have to be done, and these cuts tend to be painful.
Berlin streets were filled with entrepreneurial desperados trafficking matches, loose cigarettes, palmists, shoe shines, shoelaces, rag pickers, bag carriers, car door openers, panhandlers, ersatz barbers, and doorway sex. And Lord Davenant, Britain's ambassador, complained that this depression is the stupidest and most gratuitous in history.
Investment didn't take place, and businesses began to contract. And as they contracted, they laid off workers. And these workers, of course, could not spend.
Revolution may not have been in the air, but the fear of revolution was. And a Soviet football team scheduled to play a friendly international was denied entry into England on account of fears that the visit might be exploited by Soviet propaganda.
There was a real fear of international communism in the 1920s and 1930s, and it was not entirely misplaced. I mean, the Soviet government was a very curious hybrid. On the one hand, it behaved like an ordinary government. It signed treaties and trade agreements, and it had ambassadors with various exchange of ambassadors with various people. But it was also headquarters of the Comintern, Communist International, which was dedicated to creating revolution.
Soviet peasants, meanwhile, did not slide silently into collectivization. The secret police, the Cheka, reported 402 revolts in January 1930, 1,048 in February, and 6,528 in March. Almost 14,000 riots and revolts involving 2.5 million peasants in 1930. And the apparatus of the state, effective if not efficient, had closed 80% of Soviet village churches by the end of 1930. It was becoming one of the observable phenomena of the age, that ruthless totalitarian regimes could get things done, in contrast to the instability inherent in gimcrack but democratic coalitions. A fine example of which was the government put together in France by André Tardieu, who was obliged to patch together a cabinet of 33 members, prompting radical leader Edouard Daladier to say, "It's not a cabinet, it's a tribe." Some political leaders did not even have the power to form fragile coalitions. 1930 was the year of, perhaps, the best-known event in the Indian campaign for independence.
Until Gandhi, it had been very much a small club of liberal elites petitioning the British. Gandhi brought a very different conception of what Indian nationalism could be. He made it a mass movement.
The salt tax cost the average Indian at most 15 cents a year. But salt was an essential of life, and the British had the monopoly.
Gandhi was really a genius of manipulating mass media, if you like. He was a genius of speaking to many different audiences.
Monopoly was the point, and a good point it was. In rousing popular support, Gandhi's Salt March was a success.
If you look at the way he constructed his march, he was very careful to choreograph it. He designed the uniforms of all the marchers. He wanted them to look like a kind of universal procession, not just carrying political insignia. He sent his followers in advance to villages to whip up excitement so that when he came, there were crowds cheering. And then his great coup was to invite foreign film crews to film him.
Government studiously ignored the march, but Gandhi had made his point.
Gandhi was able to take potential weakness, the fact that Indians were unarmed, the fact that Indians didn't have military or even material power to fight the British, and turn that weakness into a form of power against the British.
Thousands of nationalists crowd the Great Tent to hear the farewell message of Gandhi, leader of the demands for India's independence. Its echoes were heard in London recently during the Imperial Conference, and there may be fireworks.
As 1930 closed, the poet W.H. Auden saw this Britain. He could have found the same scene almost anywhere. Smokeless chimneys, damaged bridges, rotting wharves and choked canals. Tram lines buckled, smashed trucks lying on their side across the rails. Power stations locked, deserted since they drew the boiler fires. Pylons falling or subsiding, trailing dead high-tension wires. Writing in 1951, the poet Stephen Spender recalled that from 1931 onwards, in common with many other people, I felt hounded by external events. It was the year that Noel Coward's Cavalcade opened. The character Fanny asked in her song 20th Century Blues, "In this strange illusion, chaos and confusion, people seem to lose their way. What is there to strive for, love, or keep alive for?" In the spring of 1931, chaos arrived in Austria. Its largest and most reputable bank was Credit Anstalt. Baron Louis de Rothschild chaired a board that included representatives of the Bank of England and major American banks. In the spring, it failed and set in motion a cascade of events that no one was able to stop. When news of the problem reached London, Harry Seepman, an advisor to the governor of the Bank of England, said, "This, I think, is it, and it may well bring down the whole house of cards in which we have been living." Harry was right.
One of the characteristics of the decades after the end of the First World War is, I think, a strong sense that people had of endings and of crisis. Crisis of capitalism, ends of empire, somehow or other civilization under threat.
Panic is a component of every crisis. If Vienna was insolvent, then what of Berlin? As international players tried to find a way of stabilizing the situation in Austria, German banks came under pressure. and with about $1 billion of short-term credits advanced to Germany by American banks, its system too was at risk. Down came the house of cards. In the first 3 weeks of June, Germany lost half of its gold reserves, and the shockwaves from the crisis rattled banks in Hungary, Romania, Poland, and Spain. On June the 20th, President Hoover announced that the US would forego repayments from Britain, France, and Italy for 12 months if they in turn would forego reparations due from Germany. But Herbert Hoover and all his men, having consulted widely in Congress and with the British, were found to have made an omission as inexcusable as it was incomprehensible. They had neglected to tell the French. And France, whose economy was strong, and whose central bank was sitting on the second largest gold reserve in the world, was furious. France and the US argued and negotiated, and Germany continued to hemorrhage gold. On July the 7th, the Americans and French reached agreement, but whilst they had been arguing, the horse had bolted. On July the 8th, Germany's third largest bank informed the Reichsbank that it could not meet its liabilities. But the Reichsbank, having lost so much gold, could not bail out the Donnerbank without sparking a disastrous run on the currency. Gold-rich France was in a position to help and made a loan offer contingent on a number of political demands, ranging from banning nationalist demonstrations to halting construction of new warships. The central bank was not empowered to comment on, let alone act on, such demands. On Sunday, July the 12th, the German government announced that it was rejecting what every German newspaper called political blackmail. Who would offer the leadership that might halt this irrational slide? As one economic historian put it, the British couldn't, and the Americans wouldn't. As late as December, with the grip of depression tightening, American lawmakers stated that it was against the policy of Congress that any indebtedness of foreign countries to the United States should in any means be cancelled or reduced. In the context of the world's economic crisis, it was, said Sir Ronald Lindsay, Britain's ambassador in Washington, an exhibition of irresponsibility, buffoonery, and ineptitude. Surviving inflation, deflation, stagnation required resourceful resilience and a loosening of a previously rigid morality. Crime, pilfering, petty pilfering, every sort of sorry survival strategy became widespread. A fact of life that found its way into Weimar music, cabaret, cinema.
Fritz Lang's 1931 film M, which is a film about the search for a serial child murderer. And ultimately, this murderer, played by Peter Lorre, is not caught and dealt with by the police, but by a criminals court. And I think in many ways that speaks again to a lot of things that are popular or are sources of anxiety in Weimar. And that is based on a sense that law and order is collapsing.
Extremism, street thuggery was a real threat. And Bruning's decree of December the 7th, 1931, banned the wearing of uniforms. So the brown shirts, in white shirts, like so many well-drilled public servants, and with bottle tops as badges, paraded their threat to law and order. The brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, and their leader, Ernst Röhm, wanted power by violence. The party machine sought power at the ballot box. In 1931, the machine won through, and 500 members of the SA were purged. In 1934, the tension would flare again and be the death of Ernst Röhm. On September the 21st, rather than borrow money, Great Britain abandoned the gold standard, whereby the Bank of England agreed to pay on demand 113 grains of fine gold in exchange for a pound note. The world's most stable currency floated. It floated down 30% against the dollar. Confidence in one of the world's few reliable institutions was at once demolished, and the age of anxiety grew more perplexed, stumbling on with less and less to believe in.
The underlying problems of the British economy, with the steeply rising unemployment and with the government running a large budget deficit, came home to roost with a crisis over the exchange rate of the pound, a flight from sterling, a withdrawal from gold from London, near imminent banking collapse.
John Maynard Keynes, the unorthodox and somewhat visionary economist, rejoiced at the breaking of our gold fetters, which, one by one, other currencies followed, and Britain's historic past as banker to the world became a ghastly nightmare as investors around the world, fearing that defaults elsewhere would mean London being unable to meet its obligations, began to withdraw funds. In the last 2 weeks of July, Britain lost almost half of its gold reserves. Inevitably, a move from dollars to gold followed. The Swiss National Bank transferred some $200 million, the National Bank of Belgium $130 million, putting pressure on the American currency. By the end of the year, 1 in every 10 American banks had suspended operations. Money was being pulled back into the relative safety of mattresses, strong boxes, and holes in the ground. The British Labour government, obliged to consider borrowing, proceeded to plan for fiscal tightening in order to secure a loan through J.P. Morgan. The dole was to be cut by 10% and taxes raised. The deal split the cabinet and the Prime Minister resigned, retaining the premiership by forming a coalition national government with the Conservatives, his ideological opposites.
It was the King who asked Baldwin point blank whether in this moment of national peril and national crisis he would be willing to serve under MacDonald. What answer could a patriotic Conservative Party leader give to that other than yes?
The budget cuts did no good, and the loan, matched by one from a consortium of French banks, was spent in 3 weeks as unemployment dragged tax yields down, while the cost of unemployment benefits soared, rising in the UK from £12 million in 1928 to £125 million in 1931. The strain and drain on Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, was visible. Churchill called him the boneless wonder, and the fizz is out of him, said Lloyd George. Strain may have also contributed to the early death of Spanish dictator Miguel Primo de Rivera. He lost the support of the king and the military, left office, and within 2 months was dead at the age of 60.
When the Great Depression started, because of the huge loans that had been taken to pay for all the various public works, there was an economic collapse. And eventually, by January of 1930, he felt that he couldn't carry on anymore. And he literally upped and went, almost without warning.
A broad-based coalition of socialists and middle-class Republicans with a reform agenda was elected to follow de Rivera into power on April the 14th, 1931.
it's a period of enormous change, enormous experimentation, enormous progress in many ways. But the problem is that there is a polarization, and there's the discourse becomes violent, and people tend to demonize the opposition. So there's intense dialogue among the people who shared their own ideas, but there's no dialogue between people who have different ideas, and that's the problem.
The death knell of the Spanish monarchy had been sounded in April's provincial elections, which, having effectively become a plebiscite on royal rule, and Alfonso XIII voted Republican. The Republic was declared, and the royal family departed noiselessly into exile.
Thousands of people jammed Victoria Station to get a look at King Alfonso, who has taken refuge among his royal British relatives. His Ex-Majesty had to leave Spain in a hurry. But is he downhearted? He doesn't look it, even though he is just plain Mr. Alphonse Bourbon.
But whose republic did they leave behind? The Republican government, faced with the fiscal shambles left by the ambitious but inept Primo de Rivera, was immediately hampered when J.P. Morgan cancelled the $60 million loan it had agreed with the now-departed regime. The stage was set for something, but no one could foresee how terrible and bloody that something would be. France continued its double life of patchwork coalitions, unstable and short-lived, side by side with les années folles, the crazy years of Paris between the wars. A Paris in which Josephine Baker's signature song, J'ai deux amours, which she first recorded in 1931, rang out, celebrating the sensation she had caused. The white imagination sure is something when it comes to blacks, she said. In Italy, the Decennale, the festive celebration of 10 years since the March on Rome, took place in 1931. Not everyone was an unqualified fan of Il Duce. Giovanni Giorati, party secretary, complained that Mussolini wanted the people to believe that he not only conducted the orchestra, but also played all the major instruments. Not surprisingly, Giorati did not last. Il Duce replaced him with Achille Starace, a man he described as a cretin, but an obedient one. Far from the banking crisis and unemployment queues of Europe, Japan's campaign to modernize and industrialize was fettered by the global downturn. In a country so dependent on foreign trade and so bereft of natural resources, the Depression was a prodigious disaster, which journalist K.K. Kawakami in the New York Times of the 7th of June 1931 said had profoundly affected the mental outlook of the entire nation. In what way?
These are the years that help Hitler, or enable Hitler to get into power. These are the years which make a lot of people give up on liberal democracy. These are the years that the Japanese militarists increasingly dominate the Japanese government. Japan moves into Manchuria, or the Japanese military move into Manchuria in 1931 in defiance of orders from their own civilian government.
Shortly after 10 p.m. on September the 18th, 1931, a bomb exploded alongside the South Manchurian Railway. Japanese troops, without Tokyo's authority, had set it and then launched themselves at the Chinese, claiming that it had been a Chinese attack.
In 1931, the Japanese Guangdong Army, a garrison army based in Manchuria, the northeastern provinces of China, launched what was essentially a lightning coup. It had been planned by two relatively junior officers, but within the space of about 5 to 10 days, they managed to occupy large parts of a region that is about the size of France and Germany combined.
The blast was the first bomb of a long war. The last would drop on Nagasaki on August the 9th, 1945.
Japanese troops are steadily advancing into Manchuria and occupying towns and villages. In the wake of the fighting are being enacted the usual scenes of civilian panic. A population preyed upon by bandit overlords and baptized in military brigandage crowds the highways and attempts to flee, regardless of the fact that Japan's coming represents the biggest influence for law and established order in this corner of the globe.
I think there's general agreement that there's a lot of the Japanese government in Tokyo having to act as an apologist for what has happened, and they feel they can't go back. National imperatives will not allow them to go back.
Manchuria became Manchukuo, a puppet state with an obedient stooge on the throne, Henry Puyi, a weakling whom the Japanese had prepared for the job with 7 years of women.
On September the 22nd, 1931, the American minister in China sent a telegram to the Secretary of State. "It is my conviction," he wrote, "that the steps taken must fall within any definition of war." But the timidity of the international response to Japan's aggression bordered on indifference. Everyone had other things to worry about.
Japan essentially walks in and takes over Manchuria and turns it into Manchukuo, which means Manchu land. And what are you going to do? What the United States does is say, we're not going to recognize you. This is not terribly useful as far as the British are concerned. Indeed, the Lord President of the Council, Stanley Baldwin, a once and future Prime Minister, said, all you get from the Americans are words, big words, but just words.
Following the invasion of Manchuria, the Philadelphia Record, by no means a lone voice, declared that the American people don't give a hoot in a rain barrel who controls North China. With hindsight, we might say that the American people should have cared. But at the time, they had more immediate problems on their mind. It has been estimated that in 1931, in Chicago alone, the value of lost wages, the money that ordinary people would otherwise have been spending on the necessities of life, was $2 million each day. Relief expenditure to cover the deficiency was a mere $100,000 a day. Chicago's mayor, Anton Chernak, told Washington that it would either have to send relief to his city or it would have to send troops. Radio was a strong opiate during the Depression. In 1931, CBS's advertising revenue was $14.5 million. Other places looked for other ways of scrambling out of the hole. In 1931, Governor Fred Balzer of Nevada announced the legalization of gambling in his state and the birth of Las Vegas. But it was going to take more than the spin of a wheel to change the course of times that had grown menacing. Writing of Berlin in the winter of 1931-32, in Mr. Norris Changes Trains, Christopher Isherwood said that hate exploded suddenly, without warning, out of nowhere.